The following short essay was originally written on March 8, 2021, and retains to my ideas around trying to get more from the media we consume. I hope you enjoy. On judging anime by jury, I've always found how we rank or judge media and art to be somewhat fascinating, and this goes doubly so with anime. Almost everyone reviews and judges the media they consume in varying ways. For example, there are many who would suppose that art can't be judged on a linear scale. This is a sentiment I would generally see some sense in. After all, an out of 10 rating can rarely express how you actually feel about a work that speaks to you. However, especially in the case of TV and film, giving a score or critique is integral to the continued improvement and expression of one's feeling on a subject. As such, you may fall into the opposite camp, the one that would suggest that all media be graded and looked at on the same single logical lens. However, for the same reason, I find this method to be far too clear-cut to judge a medium as wide and varied as anime. As such, it would appear that the answer lies somewhere in the form of balance. After all, an anime may be terribly produced, with a poor score and animation, but what it makes you feel, how you empathise with the characters, that could be far more influential to your personal sensibilities. Equally, an anime or manga could prove to be antithetical to your personal beliefs, with poorly written characters and a sloppy story, but still have stunning visuals and voice acting. This brings me to the topic that interests me most: bottom-up scoring bias. It strikes me that many of us, all too often, score anime up, as in, when deciding on a token score, we start at 0 and go up based on our own system, points for music, character, story, etc. Of course, this gets heavily affected by our own biases. We all have them, whether we realise to what extent or not. And the issue I see with scoring up is it accentuates our existing problems. For example, I have a friend who ranked High School of the Dead as 0 out of 10. It was, in all likelihood, a fairly off-handed grade with no major consideration, and that's totally fine. However, one does have to wonder how you could possibly score at 0. 0 implies no enjoyment or value of any kind when using High School of the Dead as an example. That seems hard to believe. Taking it that the overindulgence in the fan service of the show or the plot simply clicked wrong with said person, then it's conceivable and fair that they may have given these two aspects 0 out of 10, or out of 5, or however many points you're attributing each factor. But what about the art style, or the highly fitting soundtrack, the character designs? By all rights, if you remove as much of your own biases as possible, then it's hard to ignore that the art style is, while fairly standard for modern anime, has harder lines and a darker colouring scheme, which cleverly adds to the show's horror aspect by using a familiar style twisted into a zombie apocalypse aesthetic. This alone would surely be enough to garner the show a point or two. Additionally, aside from a kick-ass opening song, there's really nothing bad to be said for the rest of the OST, which again suggests that additional points should have been given for that. In reality, it's easy to see why it got a 0, and that's because the scorer didn't like it. And this is something you see everywhere. For example, detractors of the Disney Star Wars films will often claim the films are hopeless in a story sense, and then offer a 0 out of 10, ignoring those films' stunning visuals and bold direction. Now, don't misinterpret me here. I'm personally not a fan of any of the Disney Star Wars trilogy, but I could never give any of them much less than a 3 or 4, purely based on the visuals, prop design, CGI, acting, and so on. Is all far too good to be completely written off by the awful story and characters. In fact, I'd probably, if pressed, score them between 5 and 7 respectively. This, in a roundabout fashion, brings me to the post's title, Judging Anime by Jury. This is a system of ranking I started using for anime some years ago, when I started adding shows on my Mel list. My conundrum came about while trying to make a top 10 best shows list, something I think all anime fans probably think about on a bus trip sooner or later. Something I still haven't managed to do. I have a top 10 favourites, but I consider that a different concept. Quite simply, I couldn't decide if the likes of Soul Eater, Code Geass, and many others were as good as something like FMAB or Evangelion. All 4 of those examples were shows I'd given a 10 out of 10 to. And as mundane as it may sound, this pointless thought exercise on a bored afternoon got me interested in why I'd given them all 10 out of 10, other than as a flippant box to be ticked on a Mal listing. In the end, what I landed on was that all 4 shows were indeed 10 out of 10s, but for very different reasons, ones that were tricky to express on a scale of 1 to 10. I was made to look at the shows from their own perspectives, not from what I thought they should do, or you, or anyone else, but what they decided they would do. And I realised I loved each of them, for among many reasons, one common one, that being that they all succeeded in doing what they set out to do. They all did what they promised in their opening quarters, not what anyone else wanted, what they promised. And while they all have their own shortcomings, none of these could possibly outweigh the good in them. As such, why wouldn't they be 10s across the board? Is Soul Eater as important to anime as Evangelion? Probably not. But does it ever want to be seen as such? Definitely no. This all in turn led me to how I treat everything now, by jury. For me to objectively, as much at least as is possible to any human, rank media, I portion it into categories, not all that dissimilar to those I've listed at earlier points in the post. However, I add in a few more that are more emotionally based. For example, how the show makes you feel is worth considering. Equally, the context of both when the show was released and when you yourself watched it should be taken into account. I also made one other court-style change to the way I look at media. All anime is innocent until proven guilty. To elaborate on this, earlier I mentioned how people have a tendency to score upwards. This can lead to a pessimistic view on the media we consume, whereby we inadvertently judge something harshly rather than optimistically. We start at the worst and go up. As such, when I go to pass inconsequential judgment on any given anime, I start at 10, the best, and work down. Rather than offering a show points for each category, I take them off when it fails. This helps me to alleviate my own biases and helps me to see shows from their own perspective. Even if I didn't like something personally, it starts at 10 and then goes down. Therefore, even if I thought it was terrible and I didn't like the stories or messages or politics of an anime, I'll proceed to only remove points for that failure in the categories. After taking, say, 2 points off for a bad narrative, I'm now down to 8. Now I'll be faced with actually looking and considering the rest of the show. If I really hate the story, rather than having my own biases cause me to write the whole thing off for it, I'm instead made to look at the rest of the show in order to understand its perspective. Rather than scoring everything through the lens of I don't like the story, I do it the other way round. This may seem excessive, and it definitely is, but I found it can actually be enlightening when watching anything. If you find a show you don't like still scores a 7 or an 8 out of 10, you may ask yourself about its contents and try to understand it better, which in turn can lead to a better view, a new perspective, and may even lead you to finding yourself changing your opinion and coming to enjoy something you first disliked. If you can see the passion in a show's art direction, music, or just the voice acting alone, then maybe through appreciating that, you can eventually see that the story wasn't as bad as you first thought, or it had a different angle you never thought to consider. There are, of course, disadvantages. As anyone who looks at my mail will see, I have a tendency to be really lenient and score shows far higher than they necessarily deserve. But this in and of itself is kind of the point. Surely we rank or score shows in order to share our enjoyment, in an often vain effort to express our sentiments towards a property. As such, I always try to enjoy the media I consume, because at the end of the day, I really believe very few shows are made with malicious intent. Even the cheapest cash grab shows will probably have a handful of dedicated and talented individuals behind the scene. A simple example of this method of scoring in action retains to my own experience with Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann. When I first watched Gurren, I loved it. I loved the art style, the direction, the story, the designs and the characters. The musical scores to die for, and on a technical level, all seemed 10 out of 10. There was just one member of the jury who stood in opposition. I'm not completely sure what his name is. He's the same one who questions whether Soul Eater could go into the same bracket as Ava. Pretension, or maybe arrogance. I guess you'd call him my sense of nuance? Was Gurren nuanced? By this I mean, did it explore the themes and depths of its world and character, plus story of course. The rest of my hypothetical jury thought it was, and I'd followed the story just fine. I'd picked up on most of the character developments and so on, but something seemed just slightly off. Maybe it was more a 9 out of 10, you know? Great to look at, fun, inspiring, but not deep enough. The seed of doubt led me to reviews and inevitably to Best Guy Ever's brilliant video on Gurren. This video is highly entertaining and in that fashion broke down what the show what made the show so great on so many levels and in so many different ways, and it gave me a whole new perspective and appreciation for the show. The point being is, that could have gone one or two ways. I could have given it 9 out of 10 because I didn't feel it was nuanced enough, or I could have just given it 10 out of 10 because I loved it. And that would have almost been worse because I would never have felt the need to look into it, to think about it. So in reality, that member of the jury, the nuance, who was standing out, he wasn't standing out because the show lacked nuance. He was standing out because I hadn't yet comprehended just how nuanced it really was. So in doing that and following this silly method, I actually ended up finding one of my all-time favourite shows and a brilliant piece of art that I just hadn't appreciated properly. I'm human at the end of the day, and therefore fallible, and I love nothing more than being humbled. That's not to say I love hearing how my favourite shows are bad, though I do sometimes seek counter viewpoints. But I do love realising I was wrong about something, or didn't quite get it, only for that to become something special. Gurren for me would have always been a 9 out of 10. But with this new perspective and upon rewatches, I've come to appreciate it as one of the greats, a classic and a personal favourite of mine. And it's merely the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this use of the anime jury scoring method. So the next time you're watching something and a certain aspect rubs you the wrong way, try giving it the benefit of the doubt. Try understanding its perspective and what its aims and goals are, and you might just find a new favourite show or appreciation for something you overlooked in the past. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.